Hey all, Broderick here with the OAnalysis for Part 1, Episode 5, titled Paradise. This episode. This is the episode that elevated the OA from a simple, entertaining show to a narrative that I love and cherish. Even the title itself brings up questions like, a paradise for who? There's a lot to unpack and go over, and this episode brings up some pretty interesting philosophical concepts. Be aware that after the time code shown on screen, I'm going to bring up a couple of major spoilers. Up to this point, my spoilers have been fairly minor. If the OA has grabbed you like it has me, and you still haven't seen it all yet, then I recommend you close this video at that time code. Anyways, without further delay, let's get into this. Our episode starts off with some amazing acoustic guitar being played while Hap makes his way through the streets of Cuba. As Hap sits down at the bar, we get a closer look at the guitarist, Renata, playing with her eyes focused downward. Back in their cages, Homer and OA are exercising and discussing movements. While Rachel sleeps, Scott bangs on his glass in an attempt to wake her up.
Scott, maybe we should let Rachel sleep.
Scott suggests that Hap may be making the gas stronger, probably as a direct result of Homer continuously needing to be gassed a second time. He also calls them out for the ridiculousness of doing some movements that will grant them freedom.
Mary, I liked you better when you were blind.
Back in Cuba, Hap approaches Renata with an offer of a cigar. She tells him that she saw him at the concert, as she takes in the crowd at the end.
It's like sleeping with a stranger and then asking their name on the way out the door.
He makes a second offer, safe passage to America in exchange for
limited participation in my study.
Smartly, she turns him down, stating she prefers to remain unknown.
Even to myself. The mind is a sticky thing.
As she leaves Hap to dance with some young hunks, Hap shows himself out. Back in his own kitchen, Hap is listening to the podcast of Brian Greene, a well-known theoretical physicist, as he talks about the possibility of the multiverse. For those curious, or for anyone that finds these topics interesting, I've included a link in the description for the transcript of the interview and the original article from 2011 on NPR. Anyways, Hap looks on in his captives as OA, Homer, and Rachel are practicing the movements. He makes his way downstairs, not convinced that they made them up as some yoga practice. When he asks what they're doing, they whistle and ignore him. Suddenly, Rachel starts yelling and banging on the glass as she sees an officer on the monitor that shows Hap his front door. Hap quickly turns on some heavy metal music to drown out the captives and rushes to meet the officer, Stan. Stan came by to seek help from Hap as a doctor. His wife suffers from ALS and has reached a point where she can barely communicate anymore. Hap tells him there really isn't much he can do, but he'll keep an eye out for treatments from Europe as
They have less regulation than us, you never know.
That evening, Homer and OA share a silent moment against the glass as Hap watches from above. Sometime later, Hap is listening to Renata play her guitar on his headphones as he formulates a plan. The next morning, he takes Homer from his cell before everyone else even wakes up. Flash forward to the present, and OA is returning home just as Nancy is looking out of her window. I find this scene weird too, as Nancy agrees to let OA walk, yet Nancy looks upset when OA returns home. Anyways, as Betty is getting ready for work the next day, we hear a news broadcast of a shooter at a local mall that killed 7 people and fled the scene of the crime. At lunch that day, the Chosen Five are discussing how Homer and OA got their movements.
The fucking paleo diet?
For those unaware, like I was, the paleo diet stems from a published book in 1975 by the gastroenterologist known as Walter M. Vogeltin, this guy. He called it the Stone Age diet, or restricting yourself only to foods that were accessible to hominins during the Paleolithic period, which lasted from about 2.6 million years ago to roughly 12,000 years ago. As they're talking, French excuses himself for lacrosse practice, but is stopped by Principal Gilchrist. After he reminds French of the scholarship dinner later that night, he makes the observation,
I can't imagine what the 5 of you have in common.
Considering he's Betty's boss, I actually find it interesting that he counts Betty in with the other four boys. Back in OA's session with Elias, he brought that classic marble maze game that everyone in the 80s seemed to have. She tells him that the FBI can't help with the other captives because they've been taken off the board. Elias asks if she's afraid that will happen to her.
I want it to happen to me.
Should I be worried then?
She tells Elias she's doubting the kidnapping had ever happened to her. He assures her, as her medical reports showed vitamin D deficiency, dental decay, and copper residue in her back scars, and that she did not imagine it. Her own proof, however, is a lot more subjective.
I couldn't have imagined love.
And she assures Elias that she isn't acting alone, even if the FBI can't help her. We'll move on to the scholarship dinner, where Buck and his chorus mates sing an a cappella version of Better Man by Pearl Jam. As the boys sing, French looks especially pensive as he watches their performance. I love how Betty gives a standing ovation at the end. After some awkward small talk, French excuses himself to find his mom, who's out in the parking lot laughing at
Mom. Mom.
Sure. When Claudette mentions,
"Fat teacher took my ear off."
French is very clearly not amused. She mocks French for his achievements and turns around all of his arguments with,
"But you do not know what life is, Alfonso."
a very clear argument can be made that French knows and understands life better than most kids his age. Unfortunately, Claudette doesn't stop there, moving on to basically telling French that she regrets having him. She tries to smooth it over by telling him,
You will be the man you will be, no matter what.
but the emotional abuse damage has already been done. French drives them home as Claudette is in no condition to drive herself. He carries her upstairs and puts her to bed. As he and Buck walk to the abandoned house, French asks,
Are we the good guys, Buck?
French brings up the point that Hap was, at one time, a high schooler, then a college student, then worked in some ER someplace.
What if we change?
We won't change like that.
I actually love how Buck quickly dismisses the idea, not just as a reassurance, but as someone who has true faith in his friends. As they meet up with everyone else, Betty congratulates and puts her arm around French, and OA opens with,
People who want power will always try to control those who truly possess it.
OA warns them that the next bit of the story is going to be hard to hear, as she tells them how even a tiny bit of freedom can be overwhelming if you've been a captive for years. We cut to Homer waking up in Hap's plane. Hap tells him he's going to help him with something, and that he has a microphone in his shirt.
Please don't talk too loudly, you give me a headache.
Flash to Homer in the hotel shower. The feeling of water over him is overwhelming, and he whacks his head against the wall. He realizes he's not being guarded over at this exact moment, so he jumps out of the shower and considers his options in the mirror. He grabs a sewing kit from the bathroom, uses it to rip the microphone out of his shirt, dresses quickly, and runs from the hotel room. At the front desk, he tells the woman he's in danger and to call the police. She picks up the phone and says a few words in Spanish, and Homer realizes that she called Hap and not the police. Which, as a side note, means Hap understood her and lied to Renata about not knowing Spanish earlier. Homer runs from the hotel and slows to a walk to not attract any attention. A few hundred feet later, Hap walks from around a corner right in Homer's path. Hap says he told the hotel staff of his son with brain damage from a football injury. Homer says he's going to call someone.
Who are you gonna call?
Who are you gonna call? God, that phrase is never gonna be usable again, is it?
Doubt it.
Homer threatens to call the FBI, but Hap plants the seed of doubt by convincing him that the FBI wouldn't come to Cuba, that there's 500,000 mines in North America, and that Prairie Scott and Rachel will starve if he does not make it back. Reluctantly, Homer agrees, and they head back to the hotel, but not before Hap lets out a sigh of relief. At the bar where we first saw Renata play, Homer is overwhelmed with the stimuli all around him. Hap gives him a cigarette to help calm his nerves as Renata takes the stage. As Renata plays, Homer is put into a trance, and all sound fades from around him as he looks at her like they're the only two people left in the world, and she's playing just for him. Not even the applause from everyone around him breaks his trance. Hap leans over to Homer, telling him,
She's the one we're here for.
He tells Homer he's to invite her up to his room when she goes to dance on the veranda. Up in the hotel room, Renata tries to get Homer to interact with her. When she asks him if he'd ever been to Cuba before, he responds with,
I've never even seen the ocean before.
and I'm reminded of episode 3 when he says he wants to.
Take my son places I've never been.
We can almost tell that's what he's thinking, and this is just one more thing that Hap has taken from him. As Renata simply touches Homer's arm, it's too much for him, and he begins to tremble. As she brings Homer to the bed, Homer begs her to just go. Instead of leaving, she sits back down next to him. She gently places her hand on the back of his head, and Homer finally gives in. When Hap opens the door, ready to gas Renata, Homer gives him an animalistic look, then focuses solely on Renata. We then see the microphone he ripped from his shirt still on the nightstand, and see Hap listening in. While Homer and Renata show sweat from their activity, OA is exerting herself through exercise in her cage. Knowing this will break them, Hap patches the sound from the microphone onto the speakers by their cages. OA realizes what it is she's listening to, falls to the floor, and exclaims,
He's alive.
How can Homer do it?
French says that he wouldn't have given in, but OA reminds him captivity is not only physical, it's a mentality that they brought with them. She sits back down with French and continues with,
Hap succeeded.
the captives felt they couldn't possibly be angels as...
We were too human.
Additionally, Hap rearranged the captives' cells, putting Scott between Homer and OA, and Renata in Homer's original cell. Rachel tries to calm Renata and OA, stating it was Hap that did this to them. As Homer tries to talk to OA, the gas in Scott's cell turns on, then back off again a second later. Scott tells the group that if he's taken, he won't make it back alive. In Hap's experiment, Scott starts pleading for his life, telling Hap,
I can tell you things. I've got information.
Scott tells Hap about the movements OA and Homer have been doing, and that they thought they were angels. Hap is slightly amused, but is also aware he broke their rebellion, and continues to put Scott in his death apparatus. As Hap finishes bringing the dome over Scott's head and starts the water pump, Scott finally tells Hap something he didn't know.
Some fucking doctor you are. Did you know she could see?
This makes Hap momentarily freeze in his tracks. As Scott twists the knife by telling Hap she's played him for a fool, Hap turns the water pump back on. As the water goes over his chin and mouth, Scott lets out another interesting observation.
You know, just because she doesn't love him doesn't mean she's ever gonna love a monster like you.
Finally, with Scott's last breath, he tells Hap,
She calls you the angel hunter!
Angrily, Hap turns his back on Scott and holds down the lever meant to push something into his ears. Instead of stopping, however, they push into Scott's skull, killing him. As the life drains from Scott's body, we see a visualization of what appears to be synapses in a garden of working paths, firing and fading out. Hap brings Scott's lifeless body back to his cage and lays him there for everyone to see. He tells Prairie that it was her lying to him that did this. Silently, OA considers Scott's corpse. She stands up and begins to move. As she finishes her movement, Homer stands and moves with her. It's at this point, I need to point out that I can sit here and talk about their movements all day, but it's the power, the energy, and the silent understanding between her and Homer that makes this scene so powerful, and there's really no way I'd be able to do it justice. Just know, it's here that Homer uses the movements to tell OA he's sorry, and even though he doesn't know what the movements can do, he trusts OA enough to follow her lead. As OA and Homer continue their rhythmic movements into the night, Rachel and Renata fall asleep. When the lights come on the next morning, OA and Homer are still performing the movements in perfect sync. When Hap wakes up, implying he literally didn't lose any sleep over Scott's death, he watches OA and Homer from his monitors. Rachel and Renata wake up. As Downtown by Magical Clouds begin to play, Rachel notices something in Scott's tank. Scott's blood that is now dried and cracked on the stone floor begins to move. OA and Homer continue their movements. Hap watches from his monitor, and Rachel and Renata are focused on Scott. With each movement OA and Homer make, more and more blood pulls into Scott until finally... At this point, I just want to say it's impossible for me to express how powerful this scene feels, and especially what it means to me. Scott tells him they were right, that there are a total of 5 movements and they need at least 5 people. The movements will open a doorway to another dimension, and as I cry uncontrollably, Scott tells them,
I have the third move.
Unable to believe what he's seen, Hap runs downstairs and watches in shock as Scott pushes himself up. Finally, the episode ends with OA finally telling the Crestwood Five how they're going to help save the other captives.
I'm gonna teach you the movements. All 5 of them. We're gonna open a tunnel into another dimension. I will travel there and rescue them.
Oh boy, what an episode. Without a doubt, this script was probably the most fun to write so far. I'm gonna be frank, it'll be hard for me to offer an objective opinion on an episode that touches me as much as this one does, but regardless, I'm going to try. First, let's start with the same question as always. Is she lying? Elias tells of her medical records, but even OA is starting to question it herself. What if she is lying, and her 7 years missing was just her being homeless in the New York subways? This may sound absurd, but there's already been several key moments that back this up. Elias's medical reports can also describe someone who was homeless and living away from the sunlight. It's implied that she's had hallucinations before, has taken antipsychotic medication that she wouldn't be able to get if she was on the streets, and her story keeps adding more and more supernatural elements to it. What if, the entire time she thinks she was in Hap's basement, she was really living in the subways? Her only food would be leftovers people throw out, probably not much better than food pellets. Instead of Hap hitting her on the head, perhaps she fell on the concrete, which is what restored her sight. Building on this, what if she sees some handsome guy every day as he catches the subway to work, and she can only see him through the glass windows? Yeah, this is getting kind of out there, so let's move on and just assume she's telling the truth. Back in my OAnalysis of Homecoming, episode 1, I mentioned I didn't know of a show where a kid shoots himself. In the comments, Fikalish, also known as Fretless Mayhem on Reddit, brought up the original music video for Pearl Jam's Jeremy, which was inspired by a 1991 suicide where Jeremy Wade Dell shot and killed himself in front of his classmates. Given that this is the second time where a Pearl Jam song is sung, I tend to believe him. Next, I want to touch on Renata's initial decline of Hap.
Mine.
Originally, I had thought she misworded tricky with sticky. It didn't occur to me at first that most likely she meant you can't unsee or unhear something. In other words, if she finds out her guitar playing was only because of her NDE and not just her own talent, skill, and dedication, it could devalue the experience for her. Now, one scene from this episode I find strange is when Homer and OA are placing their hands on the glass. It's clear OA is moving her hands onto the glass in reaction to Homer's hand, and yet Hap still doesn't realize that she can see? I think I might find this more believable if they showed that Hap wasn't at his computer. And it may just be that Hap writes it off as the idea of a blind woman gaining her sight back is actually an impossibility to him. One big point from a small scene is Claudette and French speaking in the parking lot of the school. Claudette tells French that it doesn't matter what awards he'll get or what she has or hasn't done for him, as
You will be the man you will be, no matter what.
from an existentialism standpoint, this could be called acting inauthentically or acting in bad faith. At the almost criminally most basic, this way of thinking states that pressure from an outside force causes you to believe that you have no choice. Claudette feels she had no choice but to leave Paris and raise French, and tries to instill in French that he has no other choice but to listen and obey her to become the man he will be. In existentialism, an individual always has the power to make a choice. Again, to simplify, an oppressed group's only choice isn't to just blindly obey. Each individual can fight the oppressors, either non-violently or violently. They can band together to enforce change. In extreme conditions, they can choose to flee or even end their own existence. As stated in one of the lesser-liked Matrix movies,
Choice. The problem is choice.
which in that context means the problem with forcing people into a paradise-like world is meaningless unless they're allowed to make that choice. Finally, I mentioned how powerful the scene with Scott coming back to life is for me. Not only did it bring him back, but it also healed the lesions on his body. Way back at the start, I said how this episode is what made me fall in love with this show. Several years ago, my partner and I lost somebody very close to us, and there isn't a day that passes that I don't wish I could have done more. I actually had somebody say to me that they feel the show is predictable. When I asked for a reason as to why they felt this way, they never gave me an answer. I strongly disagree, but if anyone can back this up, please let me know in the comments. Probably the biggest piece of foreshadowing from this episode would be the interview of Brian Greene. As I mentioned before, this was a real interview on NPR on January 24th, 2011. Now, the original podcast was just over 34 minutes, but again, if you find this topic interesting, I would strongly recommend listening to or reading through the transcript of this podcast. Suggesting a multiverse is only scratching the surface of the interview, but the lines they used in the episode directly relate to the existence of other dimensions. Next, I find OA's choice of words interesting when she's talking to Elias.
No, off the board. I want it to happen to me.
I know she explicitly states in the next episode, but I wonder if she would choose her words differently had she known what the end result of the movements were. As an example, it would make a little bit more sense if she said on a different board instead of off the board. One more thing I'd like to address before moving on is the title of this episode, Paradise. I asked at the start, Paradise for who? It's very clear that the 4 boys in BBA don't live in a paradise, nor do any of the captives, Renata included. It could be used ironically, although I doubt that's the case. Personally, I think it has to do with how the 5 captives feel by the end. As Stan, the police officer, says,
We just need a little bit of hope.
And bringing Scott back, that finally gave them the hope they needed. Before continuing, I'm going to do something I have not done before. Be aware the next 2 points I'm going to make include a major spoiler for the end of part 1 and a smaller plot point from part 2. If you're not okay with that, please close the video now. Okay, moving on. As I mentioned before, I'm now apt to believe the boy in the first episode was referring to Jeremy by Pearl Jam. In thinking this way, I drew the conclusion that he is actually foreshadowing the events in episode 8. The reason I didn't put this together before is because I wasn't aware of the context from Homecoming. Thinking of a kid bringing a gun to school regardless of self-harm or for the harm of others is not something I would have pieced together on my own. I have one final point to make regarding French and his mother in the parking lot. French asks her,
That's so bad?
The way Claudette words everything is meant to tell French to accept the world as it is and not go against the grain. Hell, he's been getting this message ever since New Colossus.
Of course, carry a full course load, abide by the character clause. Just don't do anything weird. Don't get in trouble with the cops or anything.
From all this, I end up feeling extremely bad for him right up through part 2. After debating, logging on to Grindr, he finally makes that choice, and that's really when his character takes a turn and starts to believe Buck on faith. It's not easy to come out to those closest to you, especially when you're consistently told to just accept things as they are. And I give the writers, and especially the actor, Brandon Perea, a lot of credit. So, that is episode 5 in the bag. Starting with this episode, the show brings up some very interesting philosophies, which is the entire reason I started writing these reviews. There's a lot more I'd like to discuss, but later episodes will arguably have better launching points, so I'm going to hold it off for now. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe and hit the bell button if you want to be made aware when the next episode comes out. Thanks, and have a great day. Peace.